In the modern era of the UFC welterweight division, dominance has taken many forms, but few were as relentless, disciplined, and quietly suffocating as that of Kamaru Usman. Known as the Nigerian Nightmare, Usman rose from relative anonymity to become one of the most statistically dominant champions the division has ever seen. Born in Auchi, Nigeria, raised in the United States, and forged through elite wrestling and unforgiving competition, Usman's reign between 2019 and 2022 was defined by control, pressure, and an almost mechanical consistency. Wins over Tyron Woodley, Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal, and Gilbert Burns placed him at the center of the UFC's most talent-rich division. Yet something never aligned. Despite his dominance, Kamaru Usman was never fully embraced as the face of the UFC. His victories were respected, but rarely celebrated. His reign was acknowledged, but often questioned. Why did one of the most effective champions in the sport struggle to win over the crowd? Why did his style spark debate instead of admiration? And why did the UFC seem to rely on him for stability, while hesitating to elevate him into a true cultural icon? This is not a story about controversy in the traditional sense. It is a story about perception, control, and the uncomfortable truth that winning does not always guarantee acceptance. As Usman tightened his grip on the division, a divide grew between what he represented to the organization and how he was received by the audience. To understand why Kamaru Usman became one of the UFC's most dependable champions, yet one of its most polarizing, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the discipline, the sacrifice, and the mindset that built a champion the system could trust, even when the fans did not. Long before championship belts and global recognition, Kamaru Usman was shaped by discipline rather than spectacle. Born in 1,987 inches, Auchi, Nigeria, he grew up in a household defined by structure, expectations, and an unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. When his family relocated to the United States, settling in Texas, Usman entered an environment where opportunity existed, but only for those willing to endure relentless pressure. Unlike many future UFC stars, there was no early path toward fighting. His first proving ground was wrestling, a sport that rewarded control, repetition, and mental toughness. At Bowie High School, and later at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, Kamaru Usman transformed himself into an elite competitor. He captured the NCAA Division II National Championship, a milestone that placed him among the most accomplished collegiate wrestlers of his generation. But this success came with a cost. Chronic knee injuries followed him throughout his career, forcing Usman to rethink how he trained, how he fought, and how long his body could last. This limitation would later define his fighting style not as a weakness, but as a calculated adaptation. When Kamaru Usman transitioned into mixed martial arts, he did so with a clear understanding of his strengths and constraints. He did not chase highlight reel knockouts. He chased control, pressure, attrition. His run on The Ultimate Fighter showcased a fighter who rarely took risks but almost never lost position. By the time he officially entered the UFC roster, Usman was already seen as a problem matchup, physically imposing, tactically disciplined, and mentally unshakable. His ascent through the welterweight division was methodical. Each win added another layer to his reputation as a fighter who could not be rushed, bullied, or outworked. Opponents struggled to impose their game, slowly breaking under sustained pressure. The defining moment of his rise came when he faced Tyron Woodley for the UFC welterweight championship. Over 5 rounds, Usman delivered one of the most one-sided title performances in division history, dismantling a dominant champion with pace, strength, and control. That victory marked the beginning of a new era. Kamaru Usman was no longer a contender, he was the standard. But as the belt settled around his waist, it became clear that dominance alone would not guarantee admiration. The qualities that made him unbeatable were the same ones that would later distance him from the audience. And as his reign began, so did the tension between effectiveness and entertainment, a tension that would soon define the most controversial chapters of his career. As Kamaru Usman settled into his reign as UFC welterweight champion, the narrative around him began to fracture, not because he was losing, but because he was winning in a way that challenged what many fans expected from a dominant champion. His style, built on pressure, clinch control, and relentless pace, was labeled by critics as boring, risk-averse, or anti-entertainment. Each successful title defense deepened the divide between effectiveness and excitement, turning Usman into one of the most debated champions of his era. The backlash intensified during his rivalry with Colby Covington. While their first fight delivered dramatic exchanges and a late finish, the build-up exposed a different controversy. Trash talk, political signaling, and personal insults dominated headlines, forcing Usman into a spotlight he never fully embraced. Even in victory, he was scrutinized not for what he said, but for how he carried himself. The perception formed quickly. Kamaru Usman was dominant, but uncomfortable to market as a hero. Questions did not stop at style or personality. Over time, persistent rumors circulated around durability and physical wear, fueled by Usman's well-documented knee issues. Though never substantiated by official findings, online speculation became a constant background noise. Training footage, post-fight interviews, and even still images were dissected endlessly. In an era where suspicion spreads faster than evidence, Usman found himself defending not actions, but optics. The UFC publicly stood by him, yet the rumors never fully disappeared. Another flashpoint came from high-profile knockouts against Jorge Masvidal. While these wins should have cemented superstar status, they instead sparked debates about matchmaking, timing, and promotional favoritism. Some fans questioned whether the UFC was protecting Usman's reign by choosing familiar opponents over fresh threats. Others argued the opposite, that Usman was being used as a reliable anchor in a volatile division. Either way, the controversy centered not on fairness, but on trust. Perhaps the most defining moment arrived with defeat. When Leon Edwards landed the head kick that ended Usman's title reign, the shock was immediate. The narrative flipped overnight. Critics reframed past dominance as vulnerability exposed. Admirers questioned whether the reign had been built on control rather than adaptability. The rematch and the subsequent loss further complicated his legacy. For the first time, Kamaru Usman was no longer the unbreakable constant the division had relied upon. Each of these controversies shared a common thread. They did not erase Usman's accomplishments, but they reshaped how they were interpreted. Wins became debates, losses became turning points, and throughout it all, the UFC faced a quiet dilemma. Kamaru Usman remained one of their most dependable champions, yet he also embodied everything that made dominance difficult to sell. Behind every argument about style, rumors, or matchmaking was a deeper issue the UFC could not ignore. Despite the controversy, Usman delivered stability. He showed up, he defended, he controlled outcomes, and in a division prone to chaos, that reliability carried enormous value, which leads directly to the question that defined his reign more than any title defense. How much was that stability worth, and who truly benefited from it? Because the answer is found not in debate, but in money and power. In the UFC, popularity creates noise, but money creates authority. This is where Kamaru Usman's reign takes on a sharper meaning. While he was never the loudest star in the welterweight division, Usman became one of the organization's most financially dependable champions. From 2019 to 2022, he headlined multiple events, delivered consistent outcomes, and minimized the risks that quietly cost the UFC millions each year. His fight purses, escalating PPV points, and performance bonuses placed him firmly among the promotion's upper earners, not because he broke records, but because he protected investments. What separated Kamaru Usman from flashier champions was predictability. He showed up healthy, he made weight, he fought disciplined. Cards built around him rarely collapsed. In a division historically plagued by injuries, pullouts, and volatile personalities, Usman functioned as an anchor champion. The UFC did not rely on him to sell chaos. They relied on him to prevent it. That role carries a different kind of financial value, one that does not always show up in headlines, but appears clearly in internal planning. This stability translated into leverage. Kamaru Usman may not have commanded the same cultural attention as crossover stars, but he commanded trust. Trust reduces risk. Risk reduction saves money. And over time, that equation elevated his standing inside the organization. The UFC could schedule international cards, title defenses, and long-term matchmaking arcs around him with confidence. That confidence is currency. Usman's earning power also extended beyond the octagon. Brand partnerships, sponsorships, and media appearances grew steadily as his reign continued. While not built on spectacle, his image aligned with professionalism, discipline, and control qualities. Sponsors value when volatility threatens reputations. The UFC understood this. Kamaru Usman was not a liability brand. He was a safe one. But money also clarified the power dynamic. Champions who depend on popularity must constantly perform. Champions who deliver stability negotiate differently. Usman did not need to manufacture drama to remain relevant. His relevance came from being essential. That shifted his position quietly, but decisively. When negotiations occurred, they were framed around continuity rather than urgency. The UFC needed Usman to keep the division functional. Replacing him was possible, but expensive, risky, and uncertain. This is why criticism never fully destabilized his reign. Style debates did not threaten his position. Rumors did not remove him from main events. Even losses were handled cautiously. The cost of losing Kamaru Usman was never measured solely in PPV buys. It was measured in instability. And that reveals the core truth of his era. Kamaru Usman was not built to be adored. He was built to be relied upon. His money did not come from hype, but from dependability. And in the UFC's business model, dependability creates a kind of power few fans ever see. But power inside the cage and power inside contracts are only part of the equation. To understand why Usman's influence lasted as long as it did, the story must move beyond earnings and into the life that made him both trusted and distant at the same time. Outside the octagon, Kamaru Usman lived a life that reflected discipline more than display. Unlike many champions who leaned into excess or spectacle, Usman presented himself as controlled, measured, and intentionally reserved. Family, routine, and preparation defined his public image. He spoke often about responsibility, legacy, and representation, particularly as a Nigerian-born champion, carrying expectations that extended beyond the UFC. This lifestyle reinforced his reputation as a professional first, a celebrity second. That restraint, however, came with a trade-off. While it earned the UFC's trust, it limited emotional connection with fans. Kamaru Usman rarely invited the audience into his private world. He did not overshare vulnerability. He did not cultivate chaos. Instead, he emphasized work ethic and results. For the organization, this was ideal. For the audience, it created distance. In a sport where personality often amplifies popularity, Usman's controlled presence made him respected rather than beloved. Usman's efforts to bridge that gap were deliberate but careful. He appeared in interviews, embraced media obligations, and spoke about African representation and immigrant success. Yet his tone remained guarded. Even moments meant to humanize him were filtered through discipline. The result was a champion who felt reliable but difficult to fully relate to. Fans admired his consistency, but struggled to invest emotionally in his journey. This separation intensified after his title loss to Leon Edwards. Public reactions shifted quickly. Where dominance once drew criticism, vulnerability now drew curiosity. Yet Usman's response remained consistent. He accepted defeat publicly, avoided excuses, and returned to competition without spectacle. This reinforced his image as a professional, but also highlighted how deeply his identity was tied to control. The cracks never became chaos. They were managed. Behind the scenes, this lifestyle mattered enormously. Kamaru Usman was easy to work with. He met obligations. He avoided controversy that could threaten sponsors or broadcast partners. In an era when fighters increasingly challenged the UFC publicly, Usman did not. That restraint earned him institutional goodwill that extended far beyond fight night. But this same restraint shaped how his reign was remembered. While other champions burned brightly and briefly, Usman's era felt methodical, controlled, almost industrial, and that perception followed him everywhere. Victories were expected. losses were analyzed coldly. The emotional highs and lows that define fan favorites rarely appeared. In the end, Kamaru Usman's life outside the cage mirrored his fighting style. Efficient, disciplined, purposeful. It made him indispensable to the UFC, but also left him standing slightly apart from the crowd he dominated. And that brings the story to its most revealing question. If Usman's value came from reliability rather than affection, then why did the UFC rely on him so heavily? And what would the division truly look like without a champion built on control rather than charisma? For the UFC, losing Kamaru Usman was never just about losing a belt, it was about losing structure. During his reign, the welterweight division functioned with a rare level of order. Rankings were clear, title shots followed logic. Events could be planned months in advance without fear of implosion. In a division historically defined by volatility, Usman became the constant. That alone made him difficult to replace. The first reason was reliability. Kamaru Usman showed up. He made weight. He fought through injuries that would have sidelined other champions. Cards built around him almost never collapsed. From a business perspective, this mattered more than star power. The UFC could trust him to headline events without last-minute chaos, refunds, or emergency reshuffles. That trust translated into institutional dependence. The second reason was risk management. Usman generated minimal off-cage problems. No legal drama. No public feuds with management. No unpredictable behavior that could threaten sponsors or broadcasters. In an era where fighters increasingly challenged the UFC's authority, Usman did not. He competed, fulfilled obligations, and kept disputes private. That made him a low-risk champion in a high-risk sport. The third factor was division control. Usman's dominance slowed turnover. Contenders lined up, but few broke through. This stability allowed the UFC to stretch rivalries, time rematches, and manage matchmaking with precision. While fans debated excitement, the organization benefited from predictability. Removing Usman too quickly would have reopened the door to chaos, short reigns, disputed champions, and fractured narratives. There was also the issue of replacement. Finding a champion who combined wrestling control, striking improvements, durability, and professionalism was not easy. Others had charisma, others had knockout power. Few had Usman's consistency. Replacing him meant gambling on volatility, and volatility is expensive. Finally, there was symbolism. Kamaru Usman represented a model champion for the UFC's modern business era. Disciplined, media-capable, globally representative, he proved that dominance did not need spectacle to function. Losing him prematurely would have signaled instability, not evolution. This is why, even as criticism grew and losses arrived, Usman was never discarded. He was repositioned, respected, kept close. The UFC did not need him to be loved. They needed him to be dependable. And that leads to the defining question of his career. Was Kamaru Usman overlooked by fans because he was too controlled or valued by the UFC? Because control is exactly what they prize most. When the era of Kamaru Usman is viewed in full, it becomes clear that his legacy is not defined by spectacle, but by control. He was one of the most dominant welterweight champions in UFC history, yet rarely one of the most celebrated. His reign was built on pressure, discipline, and reliability qualities that stabilized a division often consumed by chaos. And while fans debated excitement, the organization quietly benefited from order. Usman's story exposes an uncomfortable truth about the UFC. Admiration is optional. Dependability is not. Championships can change hands, but trust is harder to replace. Throughout his reign, Kamaru Usman delivered exactly what the system required: consistency, professionalism, and minimal risk. In return, he received something few fighters ever do: long-term reliance. But this raises a question that extends beyond Usman himself. What kind of champion does the UFC truly value? The one who captures hearts, or the one who keeps the machine running? Usman's career suggests the answer is rarely the one fans expect. History may debate whether Kamaru Usman deserves GOAT status at welterweight, but his impact is undeniable. He proved that dominance does not need affection, and that power inside the UFC often belongs to those who control outcomes rather than emotions. As the division moves on, his absence reveals what his presence once masked. Without Usman, stability became fragile, and in that silence, his true value finally became clear. The story of Kamaru Usman is not about being loved, it is about being relied upon.